The knock at the door was the kind that made your stomach drop, a sharp, authoritative rap that carried the weight of impending trouble. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I peeked through the peephole, I was met with the sight of a man in an expensive-looking suit, clutching a thick folder. Behind him, standing with her arms crossed and a self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face, was Karen. Not just any Karen, the Karen. The self-appointed queen of the HOA, the scourge of the neighborhood, the human equivalent of a car alarm that wouldn't turn off. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, but I opened it, already knowing whatever was about to come out of their mouths would be both ridiculous and infuriating. "Mr. Walker," the lawyer began, adjusting his tie in that overly dramatic way that suggested he thought he was about to deliver the most important speech of his life. "I am here on behalf of the Homeowners Association to formally notify you of your continued violations of community guidelines. You have ignored multiple notices, and legal action will be taken if you do not comply." Karen, barely able to contain herself, let out an exasperated sigh before cutting in. "Let me make this simple, since clearly you have trouble following rules. You live in this neighborhood, which means you are subject to HOA regulations. And we," she gestured broadly as if she were speaking for the entire world, "we do not tolerate rogue property owners thinking they can just do whatever they want." I blinked at them, then blinked again, then let out a slow breath through my nose because I had expected some level of stupidity, but this was a new record even for Karen. I stepped forward, arms crossed, looking first at the lawyer, then at Karen, and then back at the lawyer. "You do realize I don't belong to the HOA, right?" The lawyer cleared his throat, flipping through the documents. "Our records indicate." "Your records are wrong," I interrupted. "I own this property outright. It was built before this neighborhood even existed. Your HOA was formed after that. I never signed up, never agreed to anything, and as much as I enjoy these little visits from your enthusiastic board members, your rules don't apply to me." Karen let out a sharp laugh, the kind people make when they think they know something you don't. "Oh, you're one of those people. You think just because you don't want to be part of the HOA, you get to live here for free? That's not how it works, sweetie. The moment you live here, you agree to our rules. That's just how civilization works." I rubbed my temples, already feeling the migraine forming. "Karen, do you hear yourself? You're saying that by simply existing on this land, I'm somehow bound to an organization I never joined? That's like walking into a random restaurant and demanding people pay for a membership they never signed up for. That's not how anything works." The lawyer, sensing this was going sideways, cleared his throat again. "This is not a matter of personal preference. The HOA has authority over this community, and we have legal documentation that states." "Legal documentation that means nothing to me," I cut in. "Show me one document where I signed anything binding me to your HOA." Karen scoffed, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter if you signed anything. The rules are the rules." I stared at her for a moment, then burst into laughter. It wasn't even intentional, I just couldn't help it. The sheer absurdity of the situation, the unwavering confidence of someone who had absolutely no idea how the law worked, was just too much. Karen's face turned red. "Why are you laughing?" "Because this is insane," I said between chuckles. "You're seriously standing here with a lawyer, trying to intimidate me into following rules that don't even apply to me. And you actually think this is going to work?" The lawyer, now visibly uncomfortable, looked back down at his papers, probably questioning his life choices. Karen, however, was not about to back down. "This will work because I have the full support of the HOA. We've already voted to impose fines, and if you don't pay them, we will put a lien on your property." At that, I stopped laughing. "A lien on my property?" I repeated, narrowing my eyes. "You can't put a lien on something you don't own, Karen. That's not just wrong, it's illegal." The lawyer shifted awkwardly. "Well, that's a matter of interpretation." "No, it's not," I said flatly. "You know it's not. And if you actually try to do something like that, I will take legal action against the HOA. And you, personally." Karen's smug expression wavered, but she still had that glint of stubborn delusion in her eyes. "You think you're so clever," she sneered. "But the HOA always wins. Always. We'll see how tough you are when you're drowning in fines." I sighed, stepping back inside. "All right. You do whatever you think you need to do, Karen. Just don't cry when it backfires." And with that, I shut the door in her face. Not 2 seconds later, I heard Karen shriek. "Did he just slam the door on me?" I walked away, shaking my head. This was just the beginning. If Karen thought she could bulldoze me into submission, she was in for a very, very rude awakening. Karen was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. If anything, shutting the door in her face only fueled whatever twisted sense of authority she believed she had. Less than 24 hours later, I was greeted by a fresh envelope taped aggressively to my front door, marked with an official-looking HOA letterhead. It was a list of violations, each more absurd than the last. My grass was half an inch too long. My driveway was an unauthorized color. My trash bins were visible for more than 20 minutes after collection. The list went on, each bullet point dripping with the kind of petty nonsense that only an HOA drunk on its own imaginary power could conjure. At the bottom, in bold, was the fine total, $4,000 due immediately. I stared at it, genuinely impressed by the sheer audacity of it all. $4,000 for living my life exactly as I had for years before these people showed up and decided they ruled the land. I wasn't about to let this slide, but I knew Karen well enough to realize that confronting her directly would be a waste of breath. She thrived on conflict, fed off the drama, and if I gave her the satisfaction of an argument, she'd spin it into some narrative where she was the victim of a lawless renegade hellbent on destroying the moral fabric of the neighborhood. Instead, I took the letter, scanned it, and emailed it to my lawyer, who I suspected was already tired of dealing with this circus but still found enough amusement in it to keep helping me. His response came quickly. "This is a joke, right? Tell them to take their fake fines and shove them." I grinned, but before I could compose a polite yet pointed response, I heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice carrying across my front yard. "I don't know why he thinks he's special," she was saying to someone, her voice dripping with exaggerated exasperation. "This is a community and communities have rules. It's not fair to the rest of us hard-working homeowners if he gets to just do whatever he wants like some kind of outlaw." I peeked out the window and saw her standing with a small group of HOA board members, gesturing wildly toward my house as if it were a condemned building threatening to bring down property values just by existing. One of the board members, an older man who looked like he deeply regretted whatever life choices had led him to this moment, muttered something that made Karen huff loudly. "I don't care if he technically owns the land. The HOA has a responsibility to maintain order. If he won't comply, we have to escalate." Escalate. That was an interesting choice of words. I had dealt with Karen's antics before, but something told me she was about to take this to an entirely new level. I didn't have to wait long to find out how. The next morning, a tow truck appeared in front of my house. The driver stepped out, looking hesitant, while Karen stood beside him with her arms crossed, watching like a hawk. "You need to move your vehicle," the driver said, though he didn't sound particularly convinced of his own words. "HOA orders," I sighed, running a hand down my face. "And what exactly is the violation here?" I asked, already knowing whatever answer came next was going to be ridiculous. The driver glanced at Karen, who immediately jumped in. "Your car has been parked in the same spot for 3 days. That's against community guidelines." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "Karen," I said slowly, "it's my driveway." She scoffed. "And the community has rules about vehicles being left unattended for extended periods." "It's my driveway," I repeated, emphasizing each word as if I were explaining basic physics to a particularly stubborn rock. "Not a public street." Not a community parking lot. My private property. Karen rolled her eyes. You're being difficult on purpose. Just move the car, and we won't have to escalate things further. I turned to the tow truck driver. You do realize that if you touch my car, you're committing theft, right? Because Karen here doesn't have any legal authority over my property. The driver looked even more uncomfortable now, shifting from foot to foot. I think I need to make a call. He retreated to his truck while Karen fumed beside him, whispering furiously into her phone. A few minutes later, the tow truck drove off without so much as touching my vehicle. Karen, however, was far from done. Later that evening, just as I was settling in for what I hoped would be a peaceful night, my doorbell rang again. This time, it was a police officer. Karen stood behind him with the kind of smug expression that told me she thought she had finally won. Sir, the officer said, holding a clipboard, we received a complaint that you were trespassing on HOA property and refusing to vacate. I let out a slow breath, fighting the urge to laugh in disbelief. I own this property, I said for what felt like the 100th time. It's not part of the HOA. This is my land. You can check the records yourself. The officer hesitated, clearly not wanting to be involved in whatever neighborhood feud was playing out here. He turned slightly toward Karen. Ma'am, do you have any legal documents showing that this property belongs to the HOA? Karen sputtered, caught off guard. Well, no, but it's part of the community. It should follow community rules. That's not how this works, the officer said, rubbing his temple like he could feel the migraine forming. He turned back to me. Sir, if what you're saying is true, then this is a civil matter, and there's nothing for me to enforce here. I nodded. It is true. And I'd appreciate it if this nonsense stopped before I start filing harassment charges. Karen gasped dramatically, like I had just slapped her across the face. Harassment? How dare you? I am trying to maintain the integrity of this neighborhood. The officer sighed. Ma'am, if you keep calling us for disputes that aren't actual crimes, you could be the one facing legal consequences. That shut her up. For a moment. But as the officer walked away, she leaned in, lowering her voice to a furious whisper. You think this is over? This is just the beginning. I smiled. Good. I love a challenge. And with that, I shut the door again, knowing full well Karen was already scheming her next move. Karen was the kind of person who didn't know when to quit, and that was exactly why she was about to lose in the most spectacular way possible. After her failed attempt at having my car towed, after the police had walked away shaking their heads at her nonsense, and after I had made it explicitly clear that I was not bound by her imaginary HOA dictatorship, I knew she wasn't done. Karen wasn't the type to accept logic, reason, or legal fact. She was the type to double down, then triple down, then throw an entire tantrum when reality didn't bend to her will. And sure enough, just when I thought she might have finally accepted defeat, I received an official-looking notice taped to my door. It wasn't another fake fine or a passive-aggressive letter listing community violations. No, this time, Karen had gone all in. The document claimed that the HOA was officially placing a lien on my property for unpaid dues and continued non-compliance with community standards. I stared at it for a long moment, half expecting hidden cameras to pop out from the bushes and reveal that this was some elaborate prank. But no, Karen had actually done it. She had filed a fraudulent lien against my property. I knew she had no legal grounds to do this, and I knew this would crumble the second it was challenged, but the sheer nerve of it was almost impressive. Almost. Instead of getting angry, I took a deep breath and smiled because Karen had just handed me the perfect opportunity to end this once and for all. I called my lawyer, who, upon hearing what she had done, let out a long, exhausted sigh and simply said, "It's time." He knew. I knew. This wasn't just HOA pettiness anymore. This was Karen stepping into legally actionable territory, and I was about to make sure she regretted it. I filed a lawsuit against the HOA and Karen personally for harassment, fraud, and illegal lien placement. But I didn't stop there. I also contacted the local news. Because as much as I wanted legal justice, I also wanted everyone to see Karen publicly humiliate herself. And it worked beautifully. The day of the court hearing, Karen walked in with the same smug confidence she always carried, completely unaware of the disaster awaiting her. She strutted into the courtroom as if she were about to personally deliver a decree from the heavens, her head held high, her expression dripping with self-importance. But then, as she glanced around and saw the cameras, yes, actual news cameras, her smirk faltered just a little. That was the first crack. The second came when she saw my lawyer, standing beside me, calm, collected, and more than prepared to dismantle her entire case. The third and final crack came when the judge took one look at the case file and immediately frowned. The proceedings began, and my lawyer wasted no time. He laid out the facts clearly, methodically, and with the kind of precision that left no room for Karen's usual delusions. He presented the property records proving that my land was never part of the HOA. He showed the multiple notices Karen had sent me, each more ridiculous than the last. He even played a recording I had taken of our last interaction, where Karen outright admitted that she didn't have any legal claim but believed I should follow the rules anyway. By the time he was done, Karen's face had gone from smug to pale, her confidence unraveling with every piece of undeniable evidence. Then came Karen's turn to defend herself, and it was a disaster. She tried to argue that community agreements overrode property deeds. The judge stopped her immediately, his tone already bordering on annoyed. Then she pivoted, claiming that my refusal to follow HOA rules was damaging the neighborhood's integrity. The judge didn't even let her finish that sentence before cutting her off again, reminding her that property laws don't operate on feelings. Finally, she tried to claim that the lien was a necessary enforcement action to maintain order. That was the breaking point. The judge leaned forward, his expression darkening. He asked her, flat out, if she had any legal basis for the lien. Karen, for the first time since I had known her, hesitated. "Well," she stammered, "I mean, he lives here, so obviously." The judge held up a hand. "That is not how liens work. You filed a fraudulent claim against his property. That is illegal." Silence. For the first time, Karen had nothing to say. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, as if she were trying to will some kind of explanation into existence. But there was nothing left for her to spin, no more fabricated authority she could hide behind. The judge turned to my lawyer, who was already prepared. He presented the lawsuit I had filed against both the HOA and Karen personally. He detailed the harassment, the fraudulent fines, the illegal attempts to tow my car, and now, the lien that could have genuinely impacted my property ownership had I not fought back. The judge didn't hesitate. The ruling was swift. The lien was invalidated immediately. The HOA was fined heavily for attempting to enforce non-existent rules on a non-member. Karen, personally, was held liable for harassment and fraud. She was ordered to pay damages, which, considering how much trouble she had put me through, were not insignificant. And just when I thought it couldn't get any better, the judge made one final ruling. "Given the nature of this case," he said, his tone measured but firm, "and the repeated, baseless legal actions taken against the plaintiff, I am also issuing a restraining order against Ms. Karen. She is not to make further contact, directly or indirectly, with the plaintiff regarding this or any other HOA-related matters." Karen gasped. It was the loudest, most dramatic gasp I had ever heard, the kind of sound someone makes when they realize, for the first time in their life, that actions have consequences. She started to protest, but the judge simply banged his gavel, signaling that the case was over. The aftermath was glorious. The HOA, now facing both fines and public humiliation thanks to the news coverage, quickly distanced themselves from Karen, voting to remove her from the board entirely. Apparently, even her fellow HOA tyrants had a limit, and getting legally wrecked on live television was it. Karen, stripped of her imagined power, sulked in the background as the other board members tried to salvage what little dignity they had left. The neighborhood, which had mostly stayed out of this mess, finally turned against her as well. People who had once tolerated her now whispered about her in grocery store aisles, gave her side eyes at community events, and, my personal favorite, started purposely ignoring her at meetings she wasn't even supposed to attend anymore. And me? I celebrated. Not out of spite, well, maybe a little out of spite, but mostly out of relief. Karen had spent months trying to break me with her fake rules and petty intimidation, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. My property remained mine, my rights intact, and best of all, I never had to hear her voice screeching about community standards ever again. A week after the case, I received one last piece of mail from the HOA. But this time, it wasn't a notice, a fine, or a demand. It was a formal letter of apology, signed by the new board members who had taken over after Karen's spectacular downfall. They assured me that I would never be bothered again, and even included a small gift card as a peace offering. I laughed, shook my head, and tossed it onto the counter.